Consider for a moment what it meant to live in darkness. Not the gentle darkness we know today, where a flick of a switch banishes shadow. Not the temporary inconvenience of a power outage, where we grumble and reach for our phones' glowing screens. I mean true darkness, absolute, inescapable, the kind that ruled half of every human life since our species first walked upright. In 1876, as the sun set over New York City, something remarkable happened, or rather something terrible. A mother, tending to her evening tasks, leaned too close to her gas lamp. Her dress caught fire. She became the 300th victim that year, in that city alone, of humanity's desperate bargain with flame. 300 souls, consumed by the very light that was supposed to keep them safe. This was not an accident of carelessness. This was the price we paid for seeing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The streets of every great city emptied at sunset, not from choice but from fear. Crime rates rose 70% after dusk, a transformation as predictable as the darkness itself. Thieves and worse prowled the shadows where gas lamps couldn't reach, which was nearly everywhere. A single lamp illuminated perhaps 10 feet of cobblestone. Beyond that circle of weak, flickering yellow, the night belonged to anyone brave or foolish enough to claim it. Factories sat idle for 14 hours each day, their magnificent machines silent, their workers sent home because human eyes cannot thread needles or operate lathes in darkness. Millions upon millions of dollars simply evaporated into the night, lost productivity that no one could reclaim. The sun was the ultimate factory owner, dictating when work could begin and when it must cease. Humanity had conquered continents, split the atom was still decades away, but we remained slaves to the day-night cycle that governed our ancestors in their caves. And the cost of light itself? $20 per gallon for whale oil. $20. A month's wages for a laborer. An entire month of backbreaking work, traded for light that might last 2 weeks if you were frugal, if you trimmed the wick just so, if you rationed your reading and sewing to the smallest possible hours. The whales knew what we were doing to them. They fled to Arctic waters, those few that remained, diving deeper, staying longer beneath the waves. Whalers pursued them into pack ice and freezing storms, desperate men chasing desperate creatures because the world would pay any price for light. But whale oil was becoming a memory. The great cetaceans were nearly gone, and so we turned to gas. Natural gas, piped through cities in networks of iron tubes, feeding lamps in homes and streets. It was cheaper than whale oil, more reliable than candles. It was also deadly in ways whale oil never imagined. In Paris, an entire city block vanished in a single explosion. 47 people gone, just gone. A leak in a gas main, one spark from a carriage wheel on cobblestone, and buildings that had stood for 2 centuries became rubble. In London, it happened again, and Chicago. And Boston gas didn't just explode. It poisoned. It seeped through walls and filled rooms where families slept. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer, odorless and invisible. You simply didn't wake up. By some estimates, more people died from gas leaks than from gas explosions. But those deaths were quieter, less dramatic, easier to attribute to natural causes in an age when medicine was still guessing at such things. And yet we had no choice. We needed light. Human civilization required it with the same urgency we required water, food, shelter. Without light, we were animals again, huddled in darkness, waiting for dawn. 29 inventors across 7 countries understood this desperation. They felt it driving them forward through failures that would have broken lesser minds. 29 brilliant individuals, most of whose names you've never heard, racing toward the same impossible dream. Arc lights existed, of course, brilliant and beautiful. They could illuminate entire squares with artificial lightning, but they were far too bright, too expensive, too temperamental for homes. They required enormous generators and constant maintenance. They were the domain of public spaces and wealthy institutions. Not ordinary people trying to read a book or cook a meal after sunset. What the world needed was something smaller, gentler, a light that wouldn't blind you or burn down your house. A light that cost pennies instead of fortunes. A light that anyone could use. The challenge seemed simple enough. Pass electricity through a material, make it glow white-hot without catching fire or melting. Simple, except it wasn't. Not even remotely. In England, a chemist named Joseph Swan was already making progress with carbonized paper filaments. In France, Russians, Germans, Americans, all brilliant minds were exploring vacuum tubes, various materials, different designs. The solution felt tantalizingly close, just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue. But there was a problem that no one quite grasped yet. The light bulb wasn't one invention. It was three separate, equally difficult problems that had to be solved simultaneously, like juggling while solving calculus while running a marathon. First, the filament material. It had to glow white-hot without burning, melting, or disintegrating. Nothing in nature seemed capable of this trick. Every material either consumed itself immediately or glowed too dimly to be useful. Second, the vacuum. Even the tiniest amount of oxygen would cause any hot filament to oxidize and fail. Creating a vacuum inside a glass bulb sounds straightforward until you try it. Glass has microscopic pores. Air seeps through. Seals crack. One invisible leak and your filament dies instantly. Third, and perhaps most cruelly, the entire electrical system. You couldn't just invent a light bulb and plug it in. There was nothing to plug it into. The power plants didn't exist. The wiring didn't exist. The switches, the sockets, the fuses, the distribution networks, none of it existed. Someone would have to invent not just the bulb, but the entire civilization required to power it. This was the gauntlet that awaited any inventor bold enough to promise electric light. And into this challenge walked Thomas Alva Edison, 29 years old, partially deaf, formally educated only until age 12. Already famous for inventing the phonograph, but completely inexperienced in lighting technology. The scientific establishment dismissed him as a mere mechanic, a tinkerer who got lucky, someone utterly unprepared for the theoretical complexities of electrical illumination. They were wrong about him, but not in the way you might think. Edison wasn't a better scientist than his competitors. He wasn't more brilliant than Swan or more theoretically sophisticated than the German researchers. What made Edison different was something stranger, something harder to quantify. He was willing to fail more times than anyone else thought possible. He was willing to test every material on Earth if necessary. He was willing to work 100 hours straight. He was willing to lose his fortune, his reputation, his health. He was willing to document every failure in excruciating detail. He was willing to hire glassblowers and clockmakers and sword swallowers and anyone else who might solve one small piece of the puzzle. Most dangerously of all, he was willing to make promises he had no idea how to keep. In September of 1878, Edison announced to the press that he would deliver electric light to New York City within 6 months. 6 months. He said this, having never successfully lit a bulb for more than a few minutes. He said this, knowing that Joseph Swan in England was ahead of him. He said this, having no solution to the filament problem, the vacuum problem, or the infrastructure problem. He said it anyway. The announcement sent gas company stocks plummeting. Investors rushed to back Edison with hundreds of thousands of dollars. The press crowned him the Wizard of Menlo Park, the man who would banish darkness forever. And Edison, in his laboratory in rural New Jersey, surrounded by notebooks and wire and glass tubes and the dedicated chaos of his workshop, realized what he had done. He had promised to capture lightning and make it gentle. He had promised to redesign civilization itself. He had promised to do in 6 months what 29 inventors across 7 countries hadn't accomplished in a decade. The barn-burning boy who got thrown off trains for causing chemical fires, who lost his hearing to disease, who learned electricity by feeling its vibrations through his bones, that boy now held the world's expectations in his hands, and he had absolutely no idea how he would fulfill them. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Here's what makes it matter. A century and a half later, Edison's ignorance of how difficult the task would be might have been his greatest advantage. He didn't know enough to quit. He didn't understand why it should be impossible, so he simply got to work. The darkness had ruled humanity for all of history. It had devoured mothers in their kitchens and workers in their factories. It had claimed half of every life ever lived. It had seemed as permanent as gravity, as unchangeable as the spinning of the earth. One partially deaf former telegraph operator was about to prove otherwise. Not through genius, not through inspiration, not through any single brilliant insight, but through something far more powerful. The willingness to fail 10,000 times and call each failure progress. The story of electric light is not really about electricity. It's about what humans can accomplish when we refuse to accept that darkness must win. It's about the price of progress, measured not just in dollars, but in exploded laboratories and lost fortunes, and assistants killed in accidents and marriages strained past breaking. It's about the distance between a promise and its fulfillment, and what happens in that terrible, magnificent gap. The sun was setting on 1878. In homes across the world, people were lighting their gas lamps, their candles, their whale oil lanterns. They were being careful, so careful, trying not to become victim number 301. And in Menlo Park, New Jersey, Thomas Edison was preparing to work through the night. He would work through many nights. Years of nights. Thousands of failures awaited him. Bankruptcy threatened. His reputation would nearly crumble. His competitors would beat him to patents. His body would break down from exhaustion. But in the end, he would give us something worth every sacrifice. He would give us the power to hold fire without burning, the power to make night surrender, the power to see. Every legend begins somewhere ordinary. And Thomas Alva Edison's legend began with fire. He was 7 years old, standing in his family's barn in Milan, Ohio, watching flames consume the hay. Beautiful flames, dancing, spreading, transforming solid matter into light and heat and smoke. He had wanted to understand fire, to see what it did, to learn its rules. The barn burned to the ground. His father whipped him publicly in the town square, hoping to beat the curiosity out of him. It didn't work. You cannot whip curiosity out of a child any more than you can whip the leaves off a tree. The desire to understand, to test, to push boundaries until they break, that was already woven into young Thomas Edison's nature as surely as the color of his eyes. His mother, Nancy, recognized something in her son that others missed. While neighbors called him addled, while his teacher declared him too stupid to learn, Nancy saw a different kind of intelligence. A mind that needed to touch and break and rebuild, rather than simply memorize and recite. She pulled him from school after 3 months. 3 months of formal education. That was all. Everything else he would teach himself. Guided by his mother's patient hand and his own relentless questions. But then came the fever. Scarlet fever swept through Ohio in 1854, taking children by the dozens. 7-year-old Thomas survived. Barely. The fever burned through him for days, reaching temperatures that should have killed him. When it finally broke, when he finally opened his eyes again, the world had changed. It was quieter, much quieter. His hearing was damaged, severely and permanently. Voices became muffled. High-pitched sounds vanished entirely. The full orchestra of the world, reduced to a few deep instruments, playing as if through thick cloth. Most would call this a tragedy, a loss, a handicap that would limit a young boy's future. And it was all those things. Edison would never hear birds sing clearly, would never catch whispered conversations, would struggle in crowded rooms where multiple people spoke at once. But here is where the story becomes interesting. Here is where disadvantage transforms into something else entirely. In the silence that scarlet fever left behind, Edison discovered he could concentrate in ways other people couldn't, while others were distracted by every conversation, every footstep, every distant sound. Edison lived in a bubble of quiet focus. He could think deeply, completely, for hours. And stranger still, he discovered that he could feel electricity. When he pressed his fingers against telegraph equipment, he could sense the current's vibration through his bones. What he lost in hearing, he partially gained in tactile sensitivity. Electricity became something he didn't just understand intellectually, he could physically sense it, like a conductor feeling music through the floor. Years later, Edison would say his deafness was his greatest blessing. It saved me from hearing many foolish things, he claimed. Perhaps, but more importantly, it shaped how he thought, how he worked, how he approached problems. Unable to rely on verbal instructions or lectures, Edison became supremely visual. He thought in pictures, in mechanical drawings, in three-dimensional models rotating in his mind. This visual thinking style would later revolutionize technical documentation. But as a young boy, it simply meant he understood machines by imagining them, building them in his head before his hands ever touched metal. At 12, he took a job selling newspapers on the Grand Trunk Railroad, running between Port Huron and Detroit. 4 hours there, 4 hours back every day. Most boys would find this tedious. Edison found it perfect. He converted the baggage car into a laboratory. Think about that for a moment. A 12-year-old deaf boy working on a train decides the baggage car isn't being used efficiently. So he fills it with chemicals, beakers, test tubes, batteries. He runs experiments while the countryside rolls past outside. It worked beautifully for months. Then, inevitably, spectacularly, it caught fire. A chemical spill, a spark, flames spreading through the baggage car while the train thundered along the tracks at 30 miles per hour. The conductor grabbed Edison, threw him and his entire laboratory off the train at the next station. Equipment smashed. Chemicals spilled. The boy's ear was boxed so hard it may have damaged his hearing further. Edison picked himself up, gathered what wasn't broken, and kept experimenting. This is the pattern that would define his entire life. Test something, break it, get thrown off metaphorical trains, pick up the pieces. Try again. He began sleeping only 4 hours per night, not from discipline but from necessity. He was too curious to sleep. There were too many things to learn, to try, to understand. He trained himself to enter a drowsy state between sleep and waking, a twilight consciousness where his mind could work on problems without the strictures of full awareness. He discovered he could nap anywhere, on floors, leaning against walls, under workbenches. 5 minutes or 50, it didn't matter. He would drop into sleep like falling through a trapdoor, then emerge refreshed, ready to continue. This ability to work extreme hours, to push his body past normal limits, would become legendary. But it started here, in railway stations and telegraph offices, a teenage boy teaching himself to function on willpower and brief snatches of unconsciousness. The telegraph became his university. He learned Morse code so thoroughly he could send and receive faster than almost anyone in America. He understood not just how to operate the equipment, but how it worked, why it worked, what made it fail, and when something failed, he made it better. His first inventions were improvements to telegraph technology, faster relays, more reliable switches, ways to send multiple messages on a single wire. Nothing revolutionary, just incremental improvements. But each one taught him something about electricity, about materials, about how to move from idea to working prototype. At 21, he arrived in New York City with virtually no money. Within days, he had talked his way into repairing a critical stock ticker at the gold exchange. The device had broken, halting trading, costing wealthy men thousands of dollars per minute. Edison fixed it in 2 hours. They hired him on the spot. Within a year, he had improved the stock ticker so dramatically that Western Union paid him $40,000 for the patents. $40,000. In 1870, more than most men earned in a decade of grueling labor, Edison had expected perhaps 5,000. When they wrote the check, when he saw the number, he nearly fainted. He had never seen that much money. Hadn't known that much money existed for someone like him. He used it to build a laboratory, not a small workshop, a real facility. With equipment and assistance and room to fail properly, this was the crucial moment. Most inventors who got rich from one innovation would relax, enjoy their success, invest conservatively. Edison did the opposite. He bet everything on his ability to invent again, and again, and again. The pattern was set. Make something, sell it, pour all the money into the next thing. Never rest, never settle. Keep pushing until you find the edge of what's possible, then push past it. In 1877, he invented the phonograph. Even now, even knowing what happened next, this invention is staggering. Sound captured and replayed. Voices of the dead speaking to the living. Music preserved in grooves of metal. It seemed like magic because, in 1877, it might as well have been, Edison wrapped tinfoil around a cylinder, shouted, "Mary had a little lamb," into a diaphragm connected to a needle, then played it back. His own voice speaking to him. The first recorded words in human history that would later be heard. The phonograph made Edison world famous at age 30. Newspapers called him the Wizard of Menlo Park. Presidents summoned him for demonstrations. Scientists studied his methods. The partially deaf boy who got thrown off trains was suddenly the most celebrated inventor in America. Fame is a peculiar thing. It opens doors. It also creates expectations. When Edison mentioned casually at first that he was working on electric light, the world leaned forward. The Wizard of Menlo Park had promised to capture lightning. Of course he would deliver. He had given them recorded sound. What was electricity compared to that? Edison, intoxicated by his own success, by the sudden belief that he could solve anything, announced he would have electric light perfected within 6 months. 6 months. He said this in September 1878. He said it to reporters who printed it in newspapers, read by millions. He said it to investors who immediately poured money into his electric light company. He said it with the absolute confidence of a man who had never truly failed at anything he'd attempted. He had no idea what he was promising, Joseph. Swan in England already had a working bulb using carbonized paper filaments. It worked, sort of, for a little while, but not long enough, not reliably enough, not cheaply enough to matter commercially. The German researchers had mapped the theoretical challenges. They understood the physics. They could explain in precise academic language exactly why electric light was so difficult. Edison understood none of this theory. He was, as the scientists dismissively noted, just a mechanic, a tinkerer, someone who succeeded through luck and brute force rather than proper scientific method. They were right. Edison wasn't a scientist in their sense. He couldn't derive the equations governing electrical resistance or thermodynamic efficiency. He worked by intuition and experience, by building and testing and observing rather than by theory and prediction. But what the scientists failed to understand was that this approach, this mere mechanic methodology, had one crushing advantage. It produced results. Edison didn't need to understand why something worked before building it. He built it, saw what happened, adjusted, built again. Theory was something you developed after success, not before. His laboratory at Menlo Park reflected this philosophy. It wasn't a pristine research facility with carefully controlled experiments and peer review. It was chaos. Beautiful, productive chaos. He hired glassblowers because light bulbs needed glass. Clockmakers because precision mechanisms were required. A German immigrant who'd been a sword swallower because he could thread wire through impossible angles. Musicians because they had steady hands. A former sailor because he could tie knots blindfolded. Edison called them his muckers, a term of affection for people who weren't afraid to get dirty, to work all night, to fail spectacularly and laugh about it over breakfast. This team, this strange collection of craftsmen and artists and mechanics, would attempt what the scientific establishment said was impossible. But in September 1878, standing in his laboratory surrounded by equipment and assistants and the weight of his own promise, Edison finally grasped the magnitude of what he'd agreed to do. The filament had to burn without burning. The vacuum had to be perfect. The entire electrical infrastructure had to be invented from nothing. And it all had to happen in 6 months, while the world watched. His reputation was on the line. His investors' money was on the line. Gas company stocks had already fallen based on his promise. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose face. He would be ruined. Most men would panic, would hedge, would quietly reduce expectations and hope people forgot the timeline. Edison started working 100 hours per week. He filled notebooks with sketches and calculations and observations. He ordered materials from around the world. He built test apparatus that had never existed before. He told his muckers they were going to work harder than they'd ever worked in their lives, and then he discovered something that would define the next 3 years of his existence: electric. Light was harder than the phonograph, harder than the stock ticker, harder than anything he'd ever attempted, much, much harder. The 6-month promise came and went. The bulb still didn't work, not reliably, not for long enough, not cheaply enough. A year passed, then another. The newspapers that had crowned him wizard began sharpening their knives. The investors who'd poured in hundreds of thousands of dollars started asking uncomfortable questions. The scientific establishment nodded knowingly. The mechanic had finally met a problem his brute force couldn't solve. Edison's fortune, built so carefully over years of successful inventions, began hemorrhaging away at a rate of $800 per day. Every day, including Sundays, his wife Mary watched her husband age a decade in 12 months, watched him disappear into the laboratory for days at a time, watched him emerge hollow-eyed and trembling from exhaustion, only to sleep for 4 hours and return. She began hiding his morphine. He'd been using it to work through the pain, to push past physical limits that should have stopped him. Morphine was legal, common, considered acceptable for medicinal use. But Mary knew what it was doing to him. Everything Edison had built, everything he'd accomplished, was balanced on the edge of a knife, and the bulb still didn't work. But here, in this moment of potential ruin, Edison made a choice that separates the truly remarkable from the merely talented. He didn't quit. He didn't reduce his promise. He didn't blame his team or his materials or the theoretical impossibility of the task. He simply kept testing, one filament after another, hour after hour, week after week, month after month, because that's what wizards do, isn't it? They persist through the darkness, believing in light, even when every rational calculation says light will never come. The boy who burned down his family's barn was about to discover whether curiosity and stubbornness could triumph over the fundamental laws of physics. The world was about to find out if genius really was 1%, inspiration and 99%, perspiration, or if perhaps, just perhaps, the real ratio was even more brutal than that. Menlo Park, New Jersey, in 1878, was not where you would expect to find the future. It was a cluster of wooden buildings in farmland, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields and the occasional curious cow. No university, no industrial complex, no infrastructure of established science. Just Edison's laboratory, a 2-story building 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, filled with equipment that most people couldn't identify and wouldn't understand if they could. But inside those wooden walls, something unprecedented was happening. Edison was inventing the invention factory itself. Before Menlo Park, inventors worked alone. They toiled in solitary workshops, guarding their secrets, competing in isolation. They might have an assistant or two, but fundamentally, invention was a lonely pursuit. A brilliant mind against an impossible problem. Edison looked at this model and saw inefficiency. Why should one person solve every aspect of a complex problem? Why not have specialists? A glassblower for the bulbs, a machinist for the metal components, a chemist for the materials, an electrical expert for the circuits, each person doing what they did best, working in orchestrated chaos toward a common goal. This seems obvious now. Every modern research laboratory operates this way. But in 1878, it was revolutionary. Edison was creating something that didn't have a name yet, something that would later be called organized research and development. He recruited 20 men, his muckers, each one chosen not for their degrees, most had none, but for their specific skills and their willingness to work past the point of collapse. Charles Batchelor was his right hand, the man who could turn Edison's half-formed ideas into working sketches. British meticulous, patient enough to run the same test 100 times if necessary. He would lose his eyebrows 17 times to laboratory explosions. 17 times. They would grow back, singe off in a flash of failed experiment, grow back again. After the 5th time, he stopped being surprised. John Crucy, the master machinist, could build anything. Edison would sketch an idea on a napkin, rough, barely legible, sometimes just circles and arrows, and Crucy would translate it into steel and copper and glass. Devices that shouldn't work but somehow did. Mechanisms that violated Edison's own understanding but functioned anyway. Ludwig Boehm, the glassblower, came from Germany with skills learned through decades of practice. He could shape glass tubes thinner than human hair, create seals that would hold vacuum, blow bulbs of perfect symmetry. His hands were scarred from years of burns, but they never trembled, not even when forming the delicate structures that would house Edison's filaments. Francis Giel was the youngest, barely 20, eager and terrified in equal measure. He would later write that working for Edison meant abandoning any hope of normal sleep or regular meals. The laboratory ran on Edison's schedule, which meant it ran constantly, chaotically, with bursts of intensity that could last 3 days straight, followed by brief collapses into unconsciousness. There was even a laboratory cat, Orange, nameless, probably feral before wandering into the workshop. It lost patches of fur regularly to static electricity experiments. The fur would grow back. The cat didn't seem to mind. It would sleep on warm dynamos and occasionally knock over chemicals, causing minor disasters that the muckers learned to expect. This team worked in a way no one had worked before. 5 separate groups testing different approaches simultaneously. While Batchelor tested platinum filaments, Crucy would be machining improved vacuum pumps. Boehm would be blowing new bulb shapes. Huchel would be running electrical calculations. And Edison would move between them all like a conductor, suggesting, questioning, occasionally napping on a cot in the corner before waking with a new idea. They documented everything. Everything. 40,000 pages of notes over the light bulb project alone. Every test, every failure, every tiny variation in materials or voltage or vacuum pressure. They created humanity's first systematic record of innovation. A database of what didn't work that was almost as valuable as discovering what did. Because here's what Edison understood that others missed. Failure isn't the opposite of progress. Failure is progress. Every material that doesn't work eliminates one possibility. Every design that fails teaches you something. The path to success is paved with documented disasters. This was Edison's true genius. Not brilliance, not inspiration, but the creation of a system that could fail faster, learn quicker, and iterate more thoroughly than any individual genius ever could. German scientists mocked this approach. They called it brute force, unintelligent, a waste of resources. Proper research, they insisted, began with theory. You calculated what should work, tested that hypothesis carefully, published your results, and allowed peer review to validate your conclusions. Edison's method was the opposite. Test everything possible. Don't theorize, observe. Don't explain why something works until after you've made it work. Let patterns emerge from the chaos of data rather than trying to impose theoretical order before you understand the problem. The German scientists shook their heads. This wasn't science. This was mechanics, tinkering, guesswork dressed up as methodology. Then Edison's patents started arriving at the patent office. One every 11 days, on average. For years, the German scientists stopped shaking their heads quite so vigorously. But back in Menlo Park, in the daily chaos of the laboratory, the light bulb remained unsolved. Platinum seemed promising. It could withstand enormous heat. Edison and his team tested it obsessively through late 1878. They built regulators that would cut power if the filament got too hot, preventing melting. It worked, sort of. The bulbs lasted for minutes instead of seconds, but platinum was expensive, ruinously expensive. A light bulb that cost $50 to manufacture that might last an hour if you were lucky, that required complex regulators just to prevent instant failure. This wasn't a solution. This was an expensive proof that the problem remained unsolved. Edison publicly announced he'd succeeded with platinum. The press celebrated, investors rejoiced, and Edison privately knew he'd accomplished almost nothing. He needed something that would burn white-hot for hundreds of hours without breaking down. Something cheap enough to manufacture by the thousands. Something that wouldn't require a degree in electrical engineering to keep operational. He needed a miracle. What he had was determination. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Carbon, heated to extreme temperatures in the absence of oxygen, becomes incredibly hard and relatively stable. Carbonized materials had been tested before, but they were dismissed as too fragile. They crumbled. They couldn't be shaped into wires thin enough for practical use, but Edison had a different idea. What if you didn't start with carbon? What if you started with something organic, cotton thread, paper, plant fibers, shaped it into the form you needed, then carbonized it? The organic material would hold its shape during carbonization. The resulting carbon filament would be delicate, yes, but already in the exact configuration required. No manipulation needed. No handling that might break it. It was clever. It should work. In theory. In practice, nothing worked. Cotton thread carbonized beautifully, then disintegrated the moment electricity passed through it. Paper formed good shapes, then crumbled when heated. Plant fibers showed promise, then failed when attempting to achieve vacuum. Each test consumed hours of preparation. Carbonization required building a furnace hot enough to char the material without burning it completely. Installing the delicate filament inside a glass bulb without breaking it required steady hands and held breath. Creating the vacuum meant running the pump for up to 3 hours, watching gauges, checking seals. And after all that preparation, most tests lasted seconds. A flash of light, a puff of smoke, darkness, another failure to document. The vacuum pump itself became a nightmare. Air molecules are extraordinarily small. Glass has microscopic pores, creating a true vacuum. The kind of emptiness that would allow a carbonized filament to burn without oxidizing required technology that barely existed. Mercury pumps were the best available. They worked by raising and lowering columns of mercury to displace air. But they were slow, temperamental, prone to leaks. The seals between the pump and the bulb were especially problematic. Any crack, any imperfection in the joint, and air would seep back in. Edison's team rebuilt the pump design 31 times. 31 iterations of the same basic mechanism, each one addressing a specific failure mode discovered in the previous version. Wider tubes to reduce friction, better seals using specialized grease, improved mercury reservoirs, modified valves. By the time they finished, they had achieved vacuum levels never before created outside of university laboratories. It still wasn't enough. The bulb still failed. Just slower, but here is where Edison's methodology proved its worth. Each failure taught them something specific. Failure 412 showed that platinum melted at a predictable temperature, allowing them to calculate maximum voltages. Failure 931 demonstrated that paper carbonized unevenly, creating weak points in the filament. Failure 1647 was memorable for a different reason. They had run out of materials to test. Everything in the laboratory had been carbonized and tried. Everything ordered from suppliers. Everything suggested by the scientific literature. Edison looked around the laboratory, looked at his team, and said, "What about Francis's beard?" Francis Gale, the youngest mucker, had a magnificent beard, thick, full, the envy of men twice his age. He was also terrified of Edison when Edison got that look in his eyes. The look that said he'd just had an idea. The look that preceded disasters, breakthroughs, and occasionally both simultaneously. They cut a few strands, carefully carbonized them, mounted one in a bulb with trembling hands that had nothing to do with the delicacy of the operation and everything to do with the sheer absurdity of testing your assistant's facial hair as a potential filament for revolutionizing human civilization. It showed promise. It actually showed promise. For perhaps 3 minutes, the carbonized beard hair glowed steadily, white-hot but stable, before disintegrating. 3 minutes. Not enough, but more than most materials achieved. And it raised a question. What made beard hair different? Why did it last longer than cotton thread of similar thickness? The answer, they eventually realized, was structure. Hair is already optimized by evolution for strength and flexibility. It has internal structure, layers, properties that plant fibers lack. This didn't lead to a solution. No one was going to harvest beard hair industrially. But it changed how they thought about materials. Not just chemical composition, but physical structure. Not just what something was made from, but how it was arranged at microscopic scales. They began testing materials they'd previously dismissed. Bamboo, fish line, spider silk. Spider silk was particularly memorable. One of the muckers spent an entire day collecting webs from the corners of the laboratory, consolidating them, attempting to carbonize what amounted to a fistful of nearly weightless threads. The resulting material was too fragile even to handle, but the attempt itself was instructive. Spider silk's tensile strength was remarkable. If only it could be produced in quantity, treated differently. The laboratory was beginning to resemble a museum of failures. Shelves filled with burned, crumbled, melted materials. Each one labeled, each one documented, each one a testament to what didn't work. Edison would walk past these shelves sometimes, late at night, when the muckers were sleeping, and only he remained awake. He would look at the accumulated failures and see not defeat but progress. Somewhere in that vast catalogue of what didn't work lay the clues to what would. It was October 1879, more than a year past Edison's promised deadline. The investors were growing restless. The newspapers were starting to mock him. The scientific establishment was preparing "We told you so" editorials. Edison was working on test number 3000.3000 different materials. 3,000 preparations. 3,000 careful installations. 3,000 moments of hope followed by darkness. Most people would have quit. Most people would have admitted defeat, acknowledged that some problems are simply unsolvable, moved on to projects with better odds. Edison wasn't most people. He was a man who had burned down his family's barn and learned that destruction teaches lessons, who had lost his hearing and discovered that silence allows focus, who had been thrown off trains and kept experimenting. He was a man who had promised the impossible and discovered that the impossible just takes longer. Late one night, sitting in the laboratory while a particularly stubborn filament test ran through its inevitable failure cycle, Edison spotted something. A fan, decorative, bamboo. Sitting in the corner of the room, bamboo. He'd tested plant fibers before. They'd all failed, but had he tested bamboo specifically? He checked the notebooks. No, bamboo wasn't on the list. He grabbed the fan, broke off a piece, began the carbonization process. Francis Giel, watching his employer destroy decorative items at 2 a.m, wisely said nothing. You learned to recognize when Edison was following an intuition. You learned to get out of the way and take notes. The carbonized bamboo filament went into a bulb. The pump ran for 3 hours. The vacuum seal held. The electrical connections were made. Edison threw the switch. The bulb lit. White, steady, beautiful, and stayed lit. 1 hour, 2 hours, 5 hours. Edison sat motionless, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any disturbance might end whatever miracle was happening. His team woke, came to the laboratory, stood watching 10 hours. 12 hours, the sun rose outside. The laboratory's other lamps seemed dim by comparison. 13 hours and 30 minutes after it first lit, the bamboo filament finally failed. Edison stared at the darkened bulb. Then very quietly he said, "We've got it." But he told no one outside Menlo Park, because 13 hours wasn't enough. Not yet, not for commercial viability. He needed hundreds of hours, thousands, and so even in victory, even having found something that worked, Edison kept testing, because the laboratory revolution he'd created wasn't about finding one answer. It was about finding the best answer, about iterating until good became great, about refusing to settle for "it works" when "it works perfectly" was still possible. The muckers returned to their stations. The vacuum pumps began their rhythmic hissing. The notebooks opened to fresh pages. 6,000 varieties of bamboo existed around the world. Edison sent collectors to China, Japan, South America, searching for the perfect species. The newspapers would soon hear that Edison had succeeded. They would celebrate. They would print stories about the Wizard of Menlo Park, triumphing over darkness. But inside the laboratory, where the real work happened, where failure and success were both just data points on the path to perfection, Edison and his team barely noticed. They were already running the next test. There is a particular kind of desperation that comes from betting everything and watching it slip away. Not quickly, not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, day by day, dollar by dollar, like watching water drain from a bathtub, knowing you cannot stop it, knowing that when it empties completely, everything ends. This was Edison's reality from October 1878 through October 1879. 13 months, 396 days, each one consuming money, reputation, and hope. $800 per day, every day, including Sundays, including holidays, including the days when nothing worked and every test failed and the future looked like nothing but darkness. Do the arithmetic with me. $800 per day for 13 months. Over $300,000. In 1879, money when a skilled worker earned perhaps $15 per week. Edison was burning through 20 years of an average worker's wages every single day. His fortune, built so carefully over a decade of successful inventions, was evaporating. The stock ticker money, the telegraph patents, the phonograph royalties, all of it flowing into Menlo Park like water into sand, disappearing without trace. The investors were patient at first. Edison was the wizard. He had delivered before. He would deliver again. Just give him time, but time was expensive. And Edison was spending it like a man who had infinite credit with the universe. By summer of 1879, the patience was wearing thin. Letters arrived. Polite at first, then less polite. When would he demonstrate results? When would their investment begin returning profit? When would the wizard stop wizarding and start producing? Edison couldn't answer. He didn't know. He was testing materials at a rate that seemed insane even to his own team. 3 materials per day on average, every day for a year. Over 1,000 tests documented in those 40,000 pages of notes, 1,000 failures. 1,000 times watching a filament glow for seconds or minutes before dying. 1,000 ways to not make an electric light bulb. Test number 412, platinum wire, 0.3 millimeters thick, in vacuum of 29.7 inches of mercury. Result, beautiful white glow for 2 minutes and 47 seconds, then melted. The melting point of platinum is 1,768 degrees Celsius. They had achieved that temperature inside a glass bulb. This should have been exciting. Instead, it was just data. Another way that didn't work. Test number 931, carbonized newspaper, the New York Herald specifically. Result, instant disintegration upon electrical current. The carbon structure was too chaotic, too irregular. Plant fibers would be better. Add to notes. Move on. Test number 1647, Francis Gill's beard hair. Result, 3 minutes of stable glow, then failure. But those 3 minutes mattered. The structure of hair suggested new directions. Document thoroughly. Cut more samples. Francis would grow more beard. Each test required hours of preparation. Carbonizing materials meant building specialized ovens that could char without burning, reaching exact temperatures and holding them for precise durations. Too hot and everything became ash. Too cool, and carbonization was incomplete. Installing the prepared filament into a glass bulb without breaking it required steady hands and infinite patience. These carbon threads were gossamer thin, fragile as butterfly wings. A breath could shatter them. A tremor could turn hours of preparation into dust. Then came the vacuum process. 3 hours minimum, the mercury pump hissing and gurgling, displacing air molecule by molecule. Watching the gauges, checking the seals, praying that this time, this one time, you'd achieve true vacuum. And after all that, after 6 hours of meticulous preparation, most filaments lasted under 10 seconds. 10 seconds of light. 6 hours of preparation. The mathematics of this were brutal. At this rate, testing 10,000 materials would take decades. Edison was 42 years old. He didn't have decades. He didn't have years. Based on his burn rate, he didn't have months. His body was breaking down. The long hours, the constant stress, the morphine he used to push through exhaustion, it was all taking its toll. His hands trembled when he tried to write. His eyes had dark circles that made him look 20 years older. His hair was graying fast. Mary Edison watched her husband disappearing into the laboratory and emerging as someone she barely recognized. He would stagger home at dawn, sleep for 3 hours, wake screaming from nightmares about failures, then return to the laboratory without eating. She began hiding his morphine, the clear bottles that had been so readily available. She poured them out, replaced them with water, hoped he wouldn't notice. He noticed. They fought. The only recorded fight in their marriage, documented in a letter from Mary to her sister. Edison accused her of sabotaging his work. Mary accused him of killing himself slowly. They were both right. The newspapers, which had celebrated Edison so enthusiastically, began sharpening their knives. The Wizard of Menlo Park was looking more like the failure of Menlo Park. Headlines questioned whether he'd ever really invented anything or just gotten lucky. Editorial cartoons showed him surrounded by broken bulbs, looking foolish. The scientific establishment, which had been skeptical from the beginning, prepared their vindication. They had said it was impossible. They had explained why. And now Edison was proving them right through spectacular, expensive failure. In universities across America and Europe, professors used Edison as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when mechanics try to do science. This is what happens when you ignore theory and just test things randomly. This is what happens when you promise the impossible. But inside Menlo Park, something different was happening. Something those professors couldn't see from their academic heights. Edison and his muckers were learning. With every failure, they were eliminating possibilities. With every broken filament, they were understanding more about materials, vacuum, electrical resistance, heat dissipation. They were building an encyclopedia of what didn't work. And that encyclopedia was narrowing the range of what might. Francis Giel would later write about the strange atmosphere in the laboratory during those months. You would think desperation would create panic. But instead there was focus, almost calm, like soldiers in a long siege who have accepted that survival requires patience. They developed dark jokes. Charles Batchelor, after his eyebrows grew back from the 11th explosion, suggested they should stop growing them entirely to save time. John Crucy began making bets on how long each filament would last, keeping odds in a notebook. The laboratory cat, nearly bald from static experiments, was promoted to Chief Testing Officer, humor in the face of ruin. Laughter while the fortune burned. It kept them sane, but there were darker moments too. Moments that don't appear in the heroic narratives, but were real nonetheless. One of Edison's assistants, a young man named Samuel, was killed in an explosion. Not from the light bulb experiments directly, but from related electrical work. A battery short-circuited, released hydrogen gas, and a spark ignited it. The explosion was small, but Samuel was leaning over the equipment when it happened. They buried him in the local cemetery. Edison paid for the funeral. The team took 1 day off, then returned to work, because stopping meant Samuel died for nothing. Stopping meant all of it. The money, the time, the sacrifice meant nothing. This is the reality of innovation that we rarely discuss. It has a body count, small usually, but not zero. Mary Edison fell ill in the spring of 1879. Nothing dramatic, Just persistent weakness, headaches, difficulty breathing. The doctor called it nerves, prescribed rest. But Mary didn't get rest because Edison rarely came home, and when he did, he brought his anxiety with him like a physical presence. She would die in 1884 at age 29. The cause would be listed as typhoid fever, but those close to the family knew the truth. The stress of those years had broken something inside her. The worry, the fear, the watching her husband bet everything and seemingly lose. Edison, focused utterly on his work, wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. This was the cost of genius. This was what obsession demanded. Not just from him, but from everyone around him. But in October 1879, Mary was still alive, still hoping, still believing that her husband would succeed because he had always succeeded before. And then came the bamboo, the fan in the corner of the laboratory, the casual destruction of a decorative object at 2 in the morning, the decision to try just one more material, even though they'd tried 1,000 already. The carbonization process for bamboo was finicky. The material had to be heated to exactly 700 degrees Celsius and held there for exactly 47 minutes. Too much and it became brittle ash. Too little, and it retained moisture that would boil away when electrically heated, creating bubbles and weak points. But when done correctly, bamboo carbonized into a material that was simultaneously flexible and strong. The fibers aligned in ways that distributed stress evenly. The carbon structure was more uniform than paper, more stable than cotton, more durable than most plant materials. Edison didn't know any of this theoretical explanation. He just knew that when he flipped the switch, the bamboo filament lit up and stayed lit. 13.5 hours. 13 hours and 30 minutes of continuous glow. More than any material they'd tested. More than seemed possible. The muckers gathered around the bulb, like it was a campfire, like it was the only source of light in a dark world. Which in a sense it was. Charles Batchelor, whose eyebrows had finally grown back fully, didn't say anything. Just stood there with tears running down his face. Jean Crucy kept checking his pocket watch, marking the time in his betting notebook, winning money from himself. Francis Gilles, whose beard had contributed to the search, grinned so widely his face hurt, and Edison sat motionless in his chair, afraid to breathe, afraid to move, afraid that any disturbance in the air might end this miracle. He watched the filament, watched the way it glowed, watched for any sign of degradation, any dimming, any hint that it was about to fail. The sun rose outside. Morning light crept through the laboratory windows, competing with the electric bulb and losing. The bulb was brighter, steadier, more reliable than dawn itself. At hour 13, the glow finally began to dim. At 13 hours and 30 minutes, it died. 13.5 hours. From sunset to past sunrise. Long enough to light an entire night and part of the next day. Edison stared at the dark bulb for a long moment. Then very quietly, almost whispering, he said, "We've got it," but he didn't celebrate. He didn't call the newspapers. He didn't inform the investors, because Edison understood something crucial. 13 hours wasn't enough. Not for commercial viability. People didn't want a light that lasted half a day. They wanted a light that lasted weeks, months. A light you could install and forget about, that would simply work reliably every single time. Bamboo was the answer. But not this bamboo. Not the decorative fan variety. There had to be better bamboo somewhere, stronger, denser, more perfect for this purpose. 6,000 varieties of bamboo existed around the world. 6,000 different species, each with slightly different properties. Edison sent collectors everywhere. To Japan, where bamboo grew in dense forests. To China, where it had been cultivated for millennia. To South America, where tropical varieties reached heights of 100 feet. To India, Africa, anywhere bamboo could be found. Each variety was shipped back to Menlo Park. Each was carbonized according to the precise protocol they'd developed. Each was tested under identical conditions. Most were worse than the decorative fan bamboo. Some were slightly better. A few showed remarkable promise. The best came from Kyoto, Japan, a variety grown in a specific valley, harvested at a specific time of year, aged for a specific duration before carbonization. This bamboo, treated exactly right, produced filaments that burned for over 1,000 hours. 1,000 hours. 42 days of continuous light. More than 6 weeks. That was enough. That was commercial viability, but finding it required testing all 6,000 varieties. Required months more work after the initial breakthrough. Required persistence that would have broken anyone else. The world would remember October 21st, 1879, as the day Edison invented the light bulb. The day the bamboo filament glowed for 13.5 hours. What the world wouldn't remember were the months afterward. The continued testing, the refinement, the search for perfection even after success, because that's the real lesson of Edison's story. It's not about the breakthrough moment. It's about what happens after. The willingness to keep improving, keep testing, keep pushing toward better even when good enough has already been achieved. 10,000 hours of failure, the stories say. But that's wrong. It was more like 15,000 hours. And they weren't hours of failure, they were hours of learning, hours of elimination, hours of systematically mapping every path that didn't work, until finally, inevitably, only the paths that did work remained. The newspapers would write about genius, about inspiration, about the wizard's magic, but Edison knew the truth. He had won through stubbornness, through documentation, through the willingness to fail 3,000 times and call each failure progress, through the sacrifice of his health, his fortune, his wife's peace of mind, and one assistant's life, through the creation of a system that could fail faster and learn quicker than human intuition alone ever could. Magic had nothing to do with it. This was just a partially deaf man who refused to quit, aided by 20 dedicated muckers who refused to quit with him, and one laboratory cat, still missing patches of fur, still sleeping on warm dynamos, still occasionally knocking over chemicals. The cat didn't understand what they'd accomplished, didn't know that the future had just changed, didn't realize that darkness would never again rule half of human existence. The cat just knew that the laboratory stayed warm all night now, and that was good enough. Sometimes, simple contentment is the truest measure of revolutionary success. New Year's Eve, 1879. Menlo Park, New Jersey. 3,000 people are arriving by train, by carriage, by foot. They have traveled from New York, from Philadelphia, from as far as Boston. They have come to witness what the newspapers are calling the event of the century. They have come to see night transformed into day. Edison has strung 40 bulbs throughout Menlo Park, in the laboratory, along the streets, in Christie Street Station. 40 points of potential light waiting for a single moment, a single switch, a single demonstration that everything has changed. The crowd gathers in the cold December darkness, breath steaming, voices hushed. They don't quite believe it will work. Even those who want to believe, who have traveled hours to be here, harbor doubt. Electric light has been promised before. Arc lights exist but blind you. Gas lamps work but kill you. Can this partially deaf inventor really have solved what dozens of brilliant scientists could not? Edison stands near the master switch. He looks exhausted, thinner than his photographs, aged by the ordeal of the past 15 months. But his hands are steady. He doesn't give a speech, doesn't explain the science, doesn't prepare the crowd for what they're about to see. He simply throws the switch. 40 bulbs ignite simultaneously. Night becomes day. The effect is immediate and overwhelming. Women faint, actually faint, collapsing into the arms of companions. Children begin crying, terrified by this transformation of reality. Men remove their hats as if witnessing something holy, because in a sense they are. They are witnessing the end of darkness's reign, the conclusion of a tyranny that has governed human existence since we first stood upright and watched the sunset and knew we were vulnerable. The light is warm, steady, nothing, like the harsh flicker of gas lamps or the blinding intensity of arc lights. It's gentle, domestic, safe. A woman reaches out to touch a bulb, expecting heat that might burn. It's warm, yes, but not dangerously so. She can hold her hand inches away without pain. Her children can play near it without risk. For 15 minutes, the crowd stands transfixed, just watching, just experiencing steady electric light for the first time in their lives. Then someone starts clapping. Others join. Within moments, 3,000 people are applauding a light bulb, applauding the conquest of darkness, applauding what they're seeing but don't fully comprehend yet. They're applauding the end of one world and the beginning of another. Among the crowd is J.P. Morgan, the banker, the financier, the man who understands that whoever controls light will control the future. He watches the demonstration with calculating eyes, seeing not wonder, but opportunity. By morning, Morgan will have invested $300,000 in Edison's electric light company. By afternoon, gas company stocks will begin their historic plummet, losing 40% of their value in a single day of trading. By the end of the week, every major newspaper in America will have run stories about the death of gaslight and the birth of the electric age. But Morgan, standing in the electric glow of Menlo Park, is already thinking ahead. The light bulb is just the beginning, just the seed. What matters is the infrastructure, the system, the entire technological civilization that must be built to make electric light universal. Because here's what Edison has barely begun to explain to the celebrating crowd. The light bulb is useless without everything else. You need power plants to generate electricity. Massive dynamos spinning continuously, producing current that must be precisely regulated. You need copper wire running through cities, under streets, into buildings. Miles of wire, tons of copper, all perfectly insulated, properly connected, constantly maintained. You need switches, sockets, fuses, meters, circuit breakers. You need voltage regulators and current limiters and safety devices that don't exist yet. You need electricians trained to install and maintain it all. Standards for wiring, building codes, safety regulations, insurance policies, an entire professional infrastructure built from nothing. The light bulb is 1% of the solution. The other 99% hasn't been invented yet. Edison understands this. In fact, he understood it before he perfected the bulb. While his muckers were testing filaments, he was simultaneously designing the entire electrical system, sketching power plants, calculating voltage drops over distance, designing junction boxes and distribution networks. This is what separates Edison from other inventors. He doesn't just solve the immediate problem. He envisions the complete system required to make the solution practical. But envisioning is not building. And building will require money that makes the light bulb development look cheap by comparison. Pearl Street Station in Manhattan will become the world's first commercial power plant. Edison chooses the location carefully. Pearl Street is in the heart of New York's financial district. Banks, newspapers, wealthy residences. If he can electrify the richest, most visible part of the city, the rest will follow. He buys 2 buildings, tears out their interiors, installs 6 massive dynamos, each weighing 27 tons. 27 tons of spinning copper and iron, generating direct current at 110 volts. The dynamos must run continuously. Stop them, and the lights go out. So Edison installs backup systems, redundant belts, multiple boilers, crews working in shifts to maintain constant operation. The engineering challenges are immense. Copper wire loses voltage over distance. Run a wire too far, and the lights at the end are dim, almost useless. So Edison must calculate the optimal service radius. 1 square mile. That's all. Within 1 square mile of Pearl Street, electric light is possible. Beyond that, you need another power plant. He designs underground conduits for the wiring, digging up New York City streets, installing pipes, threading hundreds of miles of copper wire through them. Each connection must be perfect. When loose wire and an entire block goes dark, the work consumes 2 years and over $500,000. Morgan's investment plus Edison's entire remaining fortune. Everything. Again, all of it bet on a system that has never been tried before, that might not work, that could fail spectacularly in front of the entire world. September 4th, 1882. Pearl Street Station is ready. Edison stands at the master switch again. But this time the crowd is different. Bankers, businessmen, newspaper editors, the powerful and influential of New York City, gathered to witness their buildings transformed. Edison throws the switch. 400 bulbs ignite across 1 square mile of Manhattan. Banks, newspaper offices, wealthy homes. The New York Times building blazes with light in the middle of the day, announcing its own illumination. Within an hour, gas company stocks have plummeted another 40%. Within a week, Edison has more customers than he can serve. Within a month, he's planning Pearl Street systems for Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. The electric age has begun, but not everyone is celebrating, because Edison has made a critical decision about his electrical system. He uses direct current, DC. Current that flows in one direction at constant voltage, DC, has advantages. It's stable, predictable, safe at low voltages. Edison understands it thoroughly because it's what he's always worked with. But DC has one crushing limitation. It can't travel far. Voltage drops too quickly over distance. Even with thick copper wire, DC loses viability beyond a mile or so. This means cities need a power plant every square mile, which is expensive, complicated, requires constant maintenance. There's an alternative. Alternating current, AC, current that reverses direction 60 times per second. That can be stepped up to high voltage for transmission and stepped down for use. AC can travel hundreds of miles with minimal loss. One power plant could service an entire city or multiple cities. The efficiency gains are enormous, but AC has problems. It's more dangerous at high voltages, harder to control, less understood, and Edison doesn't trust it. Enter Nikola Tesla. Tesla worked for Edison briefly in 1884. A brilliant Serbian immigrant with radical ideas about alternating current. Edison dismissed these ideas as impractical. They argued. Tesla quit. The two men would never speak civilly again. Tesla took his AC ideas to George Westinghouse, the industrialist, the railroad man. Someone who understood that railroad electrification required power to travel long distances. Someone willing to bet on AC versus Edison's DC, and suddenly Edison has competition. Real competition. Not from someone trying to improve his design, but someone trying to replace his entire system. The war of currents begins. It will not be a polite academic debate. It will be vicious, personal, dark in ways that stain Edison's reputation forever. Edison launches a public campaign against AC current. He emphasizes its danger, demonstrates how AC at high voltage can kill. And to prove this point, he stages public electrocutions. Dogs first. Stray dogs purchased from pounds, placed on metal plates connected to AC generators. The current is switched on. The dogs convulse and die. Audiences gasp. Newspapers cover it. See, Edison says, this is Westinghouse's system. This is what he wants in your homes, then horses. Old horses bought from glue factories, electrocuted with AC current while crowds watch. The death is not quick, not clean. The animals suffer, but suffering makes the point more effectively. Then, most notoriously, an elephant. Topsy was a circus elephant who had killed 3 handlers. The circus wanted her destroyed, but wanted it done publicly, spectacularly. Edison offered to electrocute her with AC current. 1,500 people gathered at Coney Island on January 4th, 1903. Topsy was fed carrots laced with cyanide to ensure death, even if electrocution failed, then fitted with copper-lined sandals connected to 6,000 volts of AC current. The switch was thrown. Topsy convulsed. Smoke rose from her feet. 10 seconds later, she collapsed and died. Edison filmed it. Distributed the film as Electrocuting an Elephant, showing it in penny arcades as proof of AC's danger. This is the dark side of innovation. The moral compromises made in competition, the willingness to cause suffering to prove a point, to win a market, to destroy a competitor. Tesla and Westinghouse called it barbaric, and it was. But it was also effective marketing. People saw AC kill an elephant and hesitated to install it in their homes. Edison went further. He secretly funded the development of the electric chair. New York State wanted a more humane method of execution than hanging. Edison suggested electrocution, using AC current, specifically using Westinghouse's generators. The first execution by electric chair occurred on August 6, 1890. William Kemmler, convicted of murder, was strapped to a wooden chair and electrocuted with Westinghouse AC current. It went horribly wrong. The first jolt didn't kill him. He remained conscious, moaning. They applied current again. His body began smoking. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber. Witnesses vomited. The doctor declared it far worse than hanging. Newspapers reported that Kemmler had been Westinghoused. Edison's propaganda team had successfully associated AC current with gruesome death. But despite all this, despite the dead dogs and horses and elephants, despite the electric chair horrors, AC was winning because physics doesn't care about marketing. AC's ability to travel long distances made it superior for electrifying entire regions. Westinghouse could build one power plant outside a city and wire the entire metropolitan area. Edison needed dozens of power plants, each serving 1 square mile. The economics were brutal. AC was cheaper, more efficient, more practical for the emerging electrical grid. By 1892, Edison had lost. General Electric, the company formed from Edison's various electrical ventures, decided to adopt AC current despite Edison's protests. They merged with Thomson-Houston Electric Company, which used AC. They partnered with Westinghouse, and they did one more thing. They removed Edison's name from the company. The Edison Electric Light Company became simply General Electric. His name was erased from the letterhead, from the marketing materials, from the identity of the corporation he had founded, J.P. Morgan, who now controlled General Electric. Explained it simply: Edison is no longer necessary. Imagine that. Imagine being told that the company you created, that bears your name, that exists only because of your invention, no longer needs you. Edison was forced out, removed from the board, paid for his shares and dismissed. He would never again have significant influence over the company that distributed his invention worldwide. This is the reality of innovation in a capitalist system. Inventors create, financiers control, and when the inventor's usefulness ends, the financier takes over completely. Tesla fared little better. Westinghouse, facing financial difficulties, convinced Tesla to tear up his royalty contracts. Tesla agreed, trying to save Westinghouse's company. It saved Westinghouse. It left Tesla poor for the rest of his life. So the war of currents ended with both Edison and Tesla losing control, losing credit, losing the financial rewards of their innovations. But humanity won, because AC current lit the world. Power plants built outside cities transmitted electricity hundreds of miles. Rural areas got power. Factories ran around the clock. The cost of electricity dropped. The availability exploded. By 1900, 5 years after Edison's ouster, American cities blazed with electric light. Streetlights, homes, factories, theaters. The darkness that had ruled for millennia was retreating. Everywhere, Edison's greatest achievement wasn't inventing the light bulb. It was losing the war of currents. Because if DC had won, if Edison had gotten his way, rural electrification would have been impossible. Small towns couldn't afford power plants every square mile. AC made universal electrification possible. Sometimes, the best thing that can happen to an innovation is for the inventor to lose control of it. Edison spent the rest of his life working on other projects: batteries, cement, mining equipment, motion pictures. He held over 1,000 patents by the time he died, more than any individual in American history, but he never again controlled a company that bore his name. Never again held the power he'd had with Edison Electric. He was bitter about it. Privately, he felt betrayed by Morgan, betrayed by General Electric, betrayed by the system he'd helped create. But publicly he said very little. just returned to his laboratory, kept inventing, kept testing, kept documenting failures and successes with the same systematic methodology that had produced the light bulb. Because that's what inventors do, isn't it? They create, not for control, not for lasting fame, not even ultimately for profit. They create because they cannot help creating. Because problems exist and minds itch until solutions emerge. Because the world is full of darkness, literal and metaphorical, and someone has to push it back. Edison pushed darkness back. Even as he lost his company, even as his competitors triumphed, even as history began to complicate his narrative with elephants and electric chairs and moral compromises, that central truth remained. He gave humanity the power to hold light. The rest, the business, the patents, the control, was just details. Details that mattered enormously to Edison personally, but not to the revolution he'd started. The lights stayed on. That was what mattered. The lights stayed on, and they would never go off again. The light bulb was meant to do one thing: provide safe, affordable illumination. That's all. Replace gas lamps and candles with something better, but innovations never do just one thing. They ripple outward in ways their creators never imagine, transforming systems far beyond their intended purpose. The light bulb didn't just change how we see. It changed how we live, work, sleep, think, and organize civilization itself. Consider factories. Before electric light, they operated perhaps 10 hours per day during summer, even less in winter. Sunrise to sunset, with all the constraints that imposed. Expensive machinery sat idle for 14 hours every day. Not because workers didn't want to work, but because human eyes cannot operate lathes in darkness. Add electric light, and suddenly factories can run 24 hours per day. 3 shifts, continuous production, machinery that cost thousands of dollars, now working around the clock, tripling its productivity without any additional capital investment beyond the cost of electricity. Within a decade of Pearl Street Station, global manufacturing productivity doubled. Not from better machines or more efficient processes, simply from adding night shifts, from banishing the tyranny of daylight. The economic impact is difficult to overstate. Goods became cheaper as production increased. More jobs appeared. Wages rose because workers could find employment any hour of the day. The 8-hour shift became possible because factories could stagger crews across all 24 hours instead of cramming all work into daylight. The modern industrial economy, the one that lifted billions from poverty over the 20th century, required electric light. Without it, industrialization would have been constrained by the sun's schedule forever. But the changes weren't just economic. They were biological. Human beings evolved over millions of years with a specific sleep pattern. Darkness meant sleep. Light meant wakefulness. This wasn't cultural. It was written into our circadian rhythms, controlled by hormones that responded to light and dark. Then we invented the light bulb. And suddenly darkness was optional. People began staying awake 3 hours longer on average, reading after dinner, socializing into the night, working evening shifts. The rigid sunrise-sunset cycle that had governed human existence since we first evolved consciousness simply dissolved. Sleep patterns changed fundamentally. Before electric light, humans typically slept in 2 segments. First, sleep from dusk to midnight. Wake for an hour or 2. Second, sleep until dawn. This was normal, natural, documented in literature and legal records for centuries. Electric light eliminated the wake period. People began sleeping in single continuous blocks, trying to maximize their waking hours, now that waking hours could extend indefinitely. We invented insomnia, essentially, not the inability to sleep, but the expectation that we should sleep only once per night, continuously. Despite millions of years of evolution suggesting otherwise, crime rates dropped 60% in neighborhoods with electric streetlights. 60%. This wasn't subtle. This was transformation. Darkness had always belonged to criminals. Shadows were where violence happened. Light made streets visible, Witnesses possible, escape routes obvious to victims and police alike. Cities that electrified their streets saw immediate dramatic reductions in robbery, assault, and murder. The effect was so pronounced that insurance companies began offering lower rates for homes and businesses on electrified streets. But here's where it becomes interesting. Here's where the unintended consequences multiply beyond simple cause and effect. Electric light enabled night school. Workers who toiled all day in factories could now attend classes in the evening. Adult education became possible. Literacy rates climbed. Knowledge spread beyond the wealthy, who had time to study during daylight hours. Libraries extended their hours. Reading was no longer constrained by expensive candles or dangerous gas lamps. Books became accessible to anyone with a light bulb, and a few hours after work, the democratization of knowledge, one of the defining features of the 20th century, required electric light. We don't often connect these things. We think about printing presses and public schools and radio and television. But underlying all of it is the simple fact that learning requires light, and electric light made learning available to everyone. Social patterns shifted. Theaters could operate safely into the evening. Restaurants could serve dinner at 9 p.m. instead of rushing to close before darkness made streets dangerous. Entertainment industries exploded. The concept of nightlife emerged. Cities developed personalities that only appeared after sunset. Times Square became possible. Las Vegas became possible. The entire phenomenon of the modern city that never sleeps required first that we defeat sleep's master, and darkness. But perhaps the strangest unintended consequence happened in Edison's laboratory while he was perfecting the light bulb. An accident. An observation that seemed trivial at the time. What scientists later called the Edison effect. While testing different bulb designs, Edison noticed something odd. Sometimes, inside the vacuum bulb, a faint current flowed between the filament and a nearby metal plate, even though they weren't connected. Electrons were jumping through the vacuum. Edison documented this in his notebooks. He didn't understand it. The theory of electrons wouldn't be developed for another 20 years. He just noted, current flows through vacuum somehow, strange. Investigate later. He never investigated. He was too busy perfecting the bulb, then building power plants, then fighting the war of currents. The Edison effect was filed away as a curiosity. 50 years later, that curiosity became the foundation of every vacuum tube. And vacuum tubes became the foundation of radio, and television, and early computers, and radar systems that won World War II, and the entire electronics industry that preceded transistors. The light bulb, designed to replace gas lamps, accidentally discovered the principle that would enable global telecommunications. This is how innovation actually works. Not through genius predicting the future, but through careful documentation of strange observations that someone else, decades later, recognizes as crucial. Edison's systematic note-taking. His 40,000 pages documenting every test and observation created a database of knowledge that scientists would mine for generations. The muckers didn't know they were recording foundational physics. They were just writing down everything that happened, following Edison's mandate that every observation matters. The organizational model Edison created spread worldwide. The invention factory. The concept of organized research and development. Before Menlo Park, invention was a solitary pursuit. After Menlo Park, every major corporation built research laboratories. By 1900, 300 industrial research labs existed globally, all copying Edison's basic model. Teams of specialists working in coordinated chaos toward commercial applications. Documentation of every test. Systematic iteration toward improvement. General Electric built a massive research facility in Schenectady, New York. Westinghouse followed. DuPont, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel. Every major corporation realized that innovation could be industrialized. That invention could be systematic rather than waiting for isolated genius. This changed the pace of technological advancement dramatically. In the 19th century, major inventions were separated by decades. In the 20th century, they arrived annually. The accelerating pace of change that defines modern life began with Edison's proof that organized teams could innovate faster than individual brilliance, the precision manufacturing required. For light bulbs established quality control, standards that didn't exist before. Every bulb had to work identically. The filament had to be exactly the right thickness. The vacuum had to be exactly the right pressure. The glass had to be exactly the right purity. This obsessive consistency, this demand that every product match every other product precisely, became the foundation of modern manufacturing. The assembly line that Ford developed for automobiles was only possible because components could be made to such precise tolerances that they were interchangeable. Edison didn't invent precision manufacturing, but the light bulb demanded it at a scale never before required. Millions of identical bulbs, each one needing to perform identically, forced the development of quality control systems, statistical process monitoring, and standardization that spread to every industry. Even Edison's deafness contributed in unexpected ways. Because he couldn't rely on verbal communication, he developed systems of technical drawing that were supremely clear and detailed. His sketches could be understood by anyone, regardless of language or education. These drawing conventions, the way he indicated dimensions, showed cross-sections, depicted mechanisms, became standard across engineering. Technical drawing courses today still teach methods Edison developed because he needed to communicate complex ideas without being able to hear discussions about them. Disability as advantage, limitation as innovation driver. It's a theme that runs through Edison's entire life and becomes embedded in the systems he created. Consider the filament testing itself. Edison tested over 3,000 materials. Most inventors would have given up after 100, maybe 200 failures. But Edison's stubbornness, his inability to accept that something was impossible, led to the most comprehensive materials database that existed in the 1880s. That database proved valuable far beyond light bulbs. Metallurgists studying Edison's notes discovered insights about carbon structures. Chemists found information about material properties under extreme conditions. Engineers learned about vacuum technology and heat resistance. Edison's failures, carefully documented, advanced multiple scientific fields simultaneously. Failure became a resource rather than a waste. This philosophical shift that documented failure has value is perhaps Edison's most profound contribution. Before Edison, failed experiments were discarded, forgotten. After Edison, serious researchers documented every failure as carefully as every success, understanding that the map of what doesn't work is nearly as valuable as the destination. Modern pharmaceutical research follows this model explicitly. Companies test thousands of compounds, document every failure, and use that database to guide future research. The scientific method itself was refined by Edison's demonstration that systematic failure could be more productive than random success. The war of currents, which Edison lost, ultimately benefited humanity more than if he'd won. AC current's ability to transmit power long distances enabled rural electrification. Small towns, farms, remote areas that could never afford a power plant every square mile could be served by a single distant facility. By 1930, rural America was getting electricity, not because of Edison's DC system, but despite it. Westinghouse and Tesla's AC system, the one Edison fought so viciously, brought light to millions who would have remained in darkness under Edison's preferred system. Sometimes losing is the best contribution you can make. Edison's defeat forced adoption of a superior system. His stubbornness delayed, but ultimately improved the outcome. The carbonized bamboo filament process inspired Japanese industrialists in unexpected ways. They studied Edison's carbonization methods, applied them to other materials, developed expertise in high-temperature carbon processing that would later enable carbon fiber manufacturing. Modern carbon fiber, used in everything from aircraft to tennis rackets, traces its lineage directly to Edison's bamboo filament experiments. The Japanese companies that perfected carbon fiber in the 1970s were descendants of workshops that studied Edison's patents in the 1880s. Innovation cascades across time and space in unpredictable patterns. A light bulb filament becomes aerospace materials. A vacuum tube effect becomes global communications. An organizational model becomes the template for 20th century research. Even Edison's darker contributions, the electric chair, the animal electrocutions, had unintended effects. They forced development of safety standards for electrical systems. Building codes emerged specifically to prevent the kind of high-voltage accidents Edison demonstrated so gruesomely. The National Electrical Code, establishing safety standards for electrical installations, was developed partly in response to public fear generated by Edison's war of currents propaganda. His dark tactics inadvertently created the regulatory framework that made electricity safe for universal adoption. By 1920, just 40 years after the light bulb, the world was transformed. Not just lit differently, but organized differently, operating on different schedules, enabling different possibilities. Factories ran continuously. Cities never slept. Knowledge spread through evening classes. Crime decreased under streetlights. Entertainment flourished after dark. Radio connected continents through vacuum tube technology, discovered by accident while testing filaments. And Edison, now 73 years old, continued working. Still inventing, still testing, still documenting everything. He held over 1,000 patents by then, more than any other individual in American history. But he would tell you that his failed experiments generated more patents than his successes, that the systematic documentation of what didn't work proved more valuable over time than the few things that did. The light bulb was meant to replace gas lamps. Nothing more, nothing less. Instead, it rewrote human biology, transformed global economics, accelerated technological progress, democratized knowledge, and established methodologies that would govern innovation for the next century, all from a simple glass bulb with a carbonized bamboo filament, burning steadily in the darkness. Edison didn't predict any of this. Couldn't have. No one could have. That's not how innovation works. You solve one problem and discover you've transformed 50 others you didn't know existed. You set out to make light. You end up changing everything. The boy who burned down his family's barn, trying to understand fire, had given humanity the power to hold light without burning. And in doing so, he'd accidentally redesigned civilization itself, one filament at a time. One documented failure at a time. One unintended consequence at a time. The light stays on, and it illuminates far more than anyone ever imagined it would. October 18th, 1931. West Orange, New Jersey. Thomas Alva Edison is dying. He is 84 years old. His body, pushed past reasonable limits for decades, is finally surrendering. Diabetes, kidney failure, complications from a lifetime of working 100-hour weeks and sleeping on laboratory floors. He lies in bed on the second floor of Glenmont, his estate. The room overlooks his laboratory. Even now, even as his body fails, he can see the windows of the building where he spent 50 years inventing, where he tried to improve the light bulb even after it worked, where he developed motion pictures and phonographs and batteries and cement mixtures and mining equipment and 1,000 other things. His second wife, Mina, sits beside him. Mary, his first wife, died decades ago. Mina has been his partner through the later years, the quieter years, the years after he lost his company and his fame dimmed to something more manageable. Edison drifts in and out of consciousness. When he's awake, he's frustrated. There are projects unfinished, problems unsolved. He has spent his entire life moving forward, testing, iterating, and now his body demands he stop. It is very beautiful over there, he whispers at one point, staring at something no one else can see. Those are his last words. Very beautiful over there. He slips into a coma. For 2 days his family keeps vigil. The press gathers outside. Newspapers prepare obituaries. The world waits. On October 18th at 3:24 in the morning, Thomas Edison stops breathing. The news spreads by telegraph, the technology he once improved. By telephone, the technology his phonograph helped inspire. By radio, the technology made possible by his accidental discovery of vacuum tube effects. America mourns. Not just mourns, but demonstrates that mourning in a way that only seems appropriate for the man who conquered darkness. President Herbert Hoover makes an announcement. On the evening of Edison's funeral, October 21st, 1931, the nation will observe 1 minute of darkness. 1 minute. 60 seconds. Every electric light in America will be extinguished simultaneously at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. It is an impossible request. Power grids cannot simply shut down and restart. Hospitals need continuous light. Factories in the middle of shifts cannot go dark. Navigation lights on ships and aircraft cannot be extinguished without causing disasters, but people understand what's being asked. It's symbolic, voluntary, a gesture of respect. At 10 p.m. on October 21st, something remarkable happens across the nation. Times Square goes dark. The brilliant lights that never sleep extinguish. Broadway theaters dim. The streets fall into shadow. In homes across the country, people flip switches. Living rooms go dark. Kitchens, bedrooms, porch lights. Factories dim their floor lights, keeping only essential safety lighting active. Office buildings extinguish their windows floor by floor. For 1 minute, America experiences darkness. Real darkness. The kind that ruled human existence before Edison. The kind that people alive in 1931 have never truly known. Then, after 60 seconds, the lights come back on. Times Square blazes. Broadway reignites. Millions of bulbs illuminate millions of homes. The darkness was temporary. Just a reminder. Just a moment to acknowledge that darkness once ruled, and now it doesn't. And the difference is due to a partially deaf man who refused to quit. It is the only time in history that darkness has honored light. The only time the absence of something has been used to celebrate its presence. Edison is buried in Rosedale Cemetery in Orange, New Jersey. His grave is simple, no grand monument, just his name and dates. Edison seemed to understand that his real monument was not made of stone, it was made of light. Billions of lights, across the planet, burning continuously. But the story doesn't end with Edison's death. In many ways, it's just beginning, because what Edison started, the systematic improvement of technology, the industrial organization of innovation, the documentation of failure as progress, continues without him. The light bulb itself evolves. Edison's carbonized bamboo filament was brilliant for its time. It burned for 1,000 hours, enough for commercial viability. But engineers kept improving it. Tungsten filaments arrived in 1904, just 3 years after Edison lost control of General Electric. Tungsten could withstand higher temperatures than carbon. It glowed brighter, lasted longer. 2,000 hours became standard. By the 1920s, tungsten bulbs with inert gas fills lasted even longer. The vacuum Edison had struggled to create was replaced with argon, or nitrogen gas, that prevented tungsten evaporation. 5,000 hours became possible. Fluorescent lights emerged in the 1930s. Not incandescent at all. Instead, electricity excites mercury vapor, which emits ultraviolet light, which strikes phosphor coating, which glows visible white. More efficient than incandescent. Much longer lasting. 50,000 hours standard. Then in the 1990s, compact fluorescent bulbs made this technology suitable for home use. Then LEDs, light-emitting diodes that use semiconductor materials to convert electricity directly to light. 100,000 hours. A lifespan of 11 years if run continuously, 45 years if run 4 hours daily. Modern LEDs use 90% less energy than Edison's bulbs and last 100 times longer. The physics is completely different. The materials are completely different. The manufacturing process bears no resemblance to carbonizing bamboo, but they exist because Edison proved that electric light was possible, because he created the infrastructure to deliver electricity to homes, because he established the expectation that artificial light should be cheap, safe, and reliable. Every improvement built on his foundation. Every innovation stood on his shoulders. That's how progress works. You don't create perfection. You create possibility. Others perfect it. The innovation ecosystem Edison created at Menlo Park spawned descendants that transformed the 20th century. Bell Laboratories, established in 1925, explicitly modeled itself on Edison's methods. Teams of specialists, systematic testing, documentation of everything. Bell Labs invented the transistor in 1947, the laser in 1960, the Unix operating system in 1969, cellular telephone technology in the 1970s. 7 Nobel Prizes emerged from Bell Labs research, all following the basic methodology Edison demonstrated. Xerox PARC, established in 1970, followed the same model. Small teams exploring wild ideas. Systematic documentation. Commercial applications discovered through organized chaos. PARC invented the graphical user interface, the computer mouse, Ethernet networking, laser printing. Google X, Apple's research divisions, every major tech company's R&D department follows the Menlo Park template. Put smart people in a room with resources. Let them test everything. Document failures. Iterate until something works. This is Edison's real legacy. Not the light bulb, the method. The acceptance that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. That systematic persistence conquers apparently impossible challenges. That documented failure is a resource, not a waste. Every garage startup attempting to disrupt industries channels Edison's spirit, whether they know it or not. The young entrepreneurs testing product variants, pivoting after failures, iterating toward product-market fit. They're running Edison's playbook. Fail fast. Document everything. Test systematically. Don't quit when conventional wisdom says it's impossible. Silicon Valley culture, with its celebration of failure and rapid iteration, is direct intellectual descendant of Menlo Park culture. The geographic locations differ. The technologies differ. The underlying philosophy is identical. Scientists today developing quantum LEDs that use quantum dots to produce pure colors follow Edison's path. They test thousands of material combinations. They document every failure. They iterate systematically until they achieve results that seem impossible. Researchers growing bioluminescent plants, actual vegetation that glows without electricity, using genes from luminescent bacteria, are attempting something that sounds like fantasy. But their methodology is pure Edison. Test everything. Document results. Let patterns emerge from data. The boy who burned down his family's barn would understand these projects perfectly. He might not comprehend the quantum mechanics or genetic engineering, but he'd recognize the approach. Try something. See what happens. Adjust. Try again. This is humanity's fundamental method for conquering impossibility. It's how we split atoms and reached the moon, and decoded DNA, and built computers, and connected the planet through fiber optic networks. Each achievement required someone, somewhere, to try things that probably wouldn't work, document the failures, and persist until probability surrendered. Edison proved this method works. Not through theory or inspiration, but through demonstration. He took an impossible challenge, imprisoning lightning in glass, and made it mundane. Made it so ordinary that we flip switches without thinking, expecting light instantly, annoyed when it doesn't come. That transformation from impossible to mundane is the true measure of revolutionary success. Consider what Edison's world looked like. Darkness ruled half of existence. Gas lamps exploded regularly. Whale oil cost a month's wages. Factories sat idle 14 hours daily. Crime surged after sunset. Knowledge was constrained by candlelight. Consider our world now. We light our homes without thought. We work any hour. We read all night if we choose. Our cities never sleep. Our factories run continuously. Our crime rates dropped 60%. Our productivity doubled, tripled, multiplied beyond calculation. The gap between those worlds exists because a partially deaf man refused to accept that darkness must win. But here's what makes the story beautiful. Edison didn't win cleanly. He lost his company. He lost the war of currents. His carbonized bamboo filament was replaced almost immediately by better materials. His DC power system was abandoned in favor of AC. Every specific thing he championed was improved or replaced. Yet the revolution succeeded anyway. Better than if he'd won. Bigger than he imagined. More transformative than he could have predicted. This is the ultimate lesson. Innovation isn't about being right about everything. It's about being right about enough to start the cascade. You don't need perfection. You need possibility. Edison made electric light possible. Others made it perfect. That's enough. That's everything. Today, as you read this, approximately 20 billion light bulbs burn worldwide. LEDs mostly fluorescent, some incandescent bulbs remaining in older installations. 20 billion descendants of Edison's carbonized bamboo filament, lighting homes and streets and factories and hospitals and schools. 20 billion points of light pushing back darkness. 20 billion testaments to what humans can achieve when we refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. The sun still sets every evening, just as it did in 1876. But darkness no longer rules. We made it surrender. We captured lightning and made it gentle. We hold fire without burning, and it all traces back to a 7-year-old boy who burned down his family's barn, trying to understand combustion. To a teenager thrown off trains for causing chemical fires. To a young man who lost his hearing and discovered he could feel electricity through his bones. To 20 muckers working impossible hours in a wooden building in rural New Jersey. To 3,000 documented failures and 1 breakthrough at 2 in the morning. To 13.5 hours of steady glow from carbonized bamboo. To a promise made rashly and kept desperately. To a fortune spent and lost and spent again. To marriages strained and assistants killed and competitors destroyed and companies stolen. To all of it. The glory and the darkness. The triumph and the moral compromise. The genius and the stubbornness and the systematic documentation of 10,000 failures. To Thomas Alva Edison, who gave us light, and in doing so gave us everything that light made possible. The factories running continuously, the knowledge spreading through evening classes. The cities that never sleep, the reduced crime, the extended productivity, the biological transformation of human sleep patterns. The vacuum tubes that enabled telecommunications, the innovation ecosystem that accelerated progress, the methodologies that govern research still, all of it, everything that came after, every consequence intended and unintended. We live in the world Edison made, not perfectly, not without cost, but illuminated. Forever illuminated, the darkness knows it lost, the light remains. And it will remain as long as humans remember that impossible just means no one has succeeded yet. That genius is mostly perspiration. That failure documented is progress made. That stubbornness sometimes conquers physics. The boy who played with fire grew up to give humanity the power to hold it safely. The man who couldn't hear learned to feel electricity in his bones and taught the world to harness. In the wizard who lost his company and his name and his preferred. Technology still won the only victory that matters. He changed forever what's possible. Every time you flip a switch, you're touching Edison's legacy. Every time light appears instantly, reliably, safely, you're experiencing the world he made real. The bulb you use might be LED, the power might be AC, the company providing it might not even mention Edison's name, but the light burns steady. The darkness retreats, and somewhere in that simple miracle is everything we need to know about what humans can accomplish when we refuse to quit. "It is very beautiful over there," Edison said. His last words, staring at something beyond sight. Perhaps he saw what we would become. A species that conquered darkness, that made night surrender. That proved impossible problems yield to systematic persistence. Or perhaps he simply saw the light. Either way, he was right. It is very beautiful. The light remains forever bright, forever burning, because one man long ago decided darkness wasn't inevitable and proved it, one failure at a time, until failure became triumph, until darkness became light, until the impossible became simply how we live.